Hello, everybody. This is my presentation, Expressionism in Classical Music. A look into the history and context of expressionistic music, what actually made it Expressionism. So a brief history of Expressionism. It was a movement that began in poetry and art in the late 19th century. The art showcases distorted realities, which are meant to symbolize the subconscious feelings, especially with the rise of Freudianism at this time. Um, the paint involves intense or unrealistic colors, blurred like brush strokes and a lot of texture, and it was meant to portray emotions and be very mystical. Some notable artists are Munch, Van Gogh, and Matisse. The term applied to art first appeared in 1910 when Matisse and the Fauves wanted to break away from Impressionism. And including to David Fanning, the musicologist, the term soon widened to include virtually all contemporary non-traditional painting. And here are just some examples of some of Van Gogh's artwork. So here on the right, we have him in a straw hat, and on the left, there's some wheat fields with cypresses, and you can already see the texture in his beard and the straw hat and the clouds and in the wheat field. So you can see a heavily textured, kind of distorted paintings. This one is also distorted. This is by Picasso in the early 1900s. You can just see by like the unnatural body position and just the unnatural way he's posed and positioned. He is blue. The limbs are elongated. It's just very unnatural. All right, the Expressionism movement. Expressionism first appears as an adjective in the late 19th century, but it did not show up in a dictionary until 1911. It is meant to describe expression of feelings of the subconscious in unconventional ways. It is meant to express raw emotion that does not fit into the norms of tradition or beauty. And Expressionism after this, it lived on in new guises, so continued to live on even after the high of Schoenberg's music. All right, Expressionism in music. So it is the common understanding that this takes place in Schoenberg's post-tonal period, but before his 12-tone period. The current meaning of Expressionism was coined by critic Roger Elliott Fry to contrast the passivity of Impressionism. It shared with art the concepts of psychology and the unconscious, especially with the rise of Freudianism. A lot of artists took interest in trying to express that in their art. And according to Kandinsky, the artist, Expressionism demanded an emancipation from the lie of convention and tradition. All right, so what made music expressionist? So I'm going to argue that while music and art both attempted to express the emotions of the subconscious mind, composers did not originally want to coin their music as expressionism or as expressionist. Not only did it originally they did not intend for their music to be labeled as so, and this is the standpoint that I'm going to argue from. It was through critics' description of modern music that influenced public opinion of the time. The trendiness of the word expressionism, it was used kind of as a buzzword. Of the term, it became attached to itself. The term attached itself to music of Schoenberg's and Zemlinsky, who were expressionist composers. So Schoenberg's expressionism, he drew from Greek philosophy and German ideals to create his own truth as opposed to traditional beauty. His art was defined by inner vision and compulsion, not by refinement. So he wanted to stay true to his inner realities, and he denied stability in all parameters, including tone and dynamics, and it is characterized mostly by texture. So David Fanning is a musicologist, and drawing on some evidence from one of his articles, according to David Fanning, the term expressionism is a broad term used to include other music from the same period with shared characteristics. So it's used more as a broad term instead of like a pinpointed term for composers. He even called it a journalistic term, which is used to imply disapproval. He also said that expressionism had a disdain for concrete meaning, which meant that many composers recognized in essence most music was already expressionist, and that expressionist music was something of tautology. This is why composers rarely used the term to describe their own music themselves. Expressionism was not a school, according to musicologists, but rather a state of mind. Music is created by the feeling for internal or external process. After this, Schoenberg began to move into his 12-tone techniques, showing that he only dabbled in this time period for a limited amount of time. And it also shows that music moves quickly. So music that is labeled as expressionist, perhaps it wasn't intended to be labeled as so. It was just contemporary music of the time that was constantly progressing forward. Expressionistic music fell out of popularity after the World Wars as political instability and social unrest called for regulation and stability within music. Okay, and now we're going to draw evidence from another musicologist or music historian, Claire Carrasco. So according to Carrasco, like all isms, expressionism is a multifaceted construction whose meaning critics and scholars have continuously negotiated and renegotiated since its introduction into art and literary discourse circa 1910. So the term itself has even been negotiated and contradicted throughout time. So how are we supposed to know the exact meaning of expressionism during the height of Schoenberg's music? So an example from Carrasco, the 1918 premiere of Zemlinsky's second string quartet. So reviews and critics called it experimental and revolutionary, while musicologists and scholars would hesitate to call it such. She argues that the idea of modern music of the time was designated as expressionist, and discussion of Zemlinsky's quartet would intersect with the idea of expressionist. So because they were both happening at the same time and Zemlinsky's music was kind of progressive, they just automatically grouped it into this box of expressionism. While this is only an example of one composer, this trend can be seen throughout artists of the era and even through other artistic eras as well. Moving forward, so I'm not going to read these quotes as that would take a lot of time, but to summarize these quotes, these are from critics of the early 20th century, Kralik and Marx. And basically, they're just calling the music of Zemlinsky's second string quartet revolutionary and violent. So in the quote on the right, Marx labels Zemlinsky's music as expressionist. The term had yet to be widely labeled to music. This shows that music was labeled and not explicitly created to be expressionist. Also, by comparing Zemlinsky to Schoenberg, Kralik groups together composers under the same category. This also shows how critics influence the definition of expressionism in classical music. It is difficult for them to label music that does not conform to tradition and beauty. Instead, they use words such as violent and revolution just because they didn't know how else to classify it. It was unfamiliar, so they grouped it as expressionism. In conclusion, while history shows that expressionistic art and music have overlapping avant-garde attributes, I do not think composers actually wrote music with the intent of it being perceived as expressionist. While there are qualities of expressionism defined by the art movement, the term was associated with many pieces of music simply because they were too modern to be perceived as otherwise. And also during the early 20th century, the term expressionism was still developing, so it's almost hard for us with the modern term of expressionism to apply it to anything of that time. And the discourse of expressionism was heavily controlled by critics of expressionist music during the early 20th century. This led to it not only being romanticized, so like finding meaning within the grotesque and the painful context of the music, but it forced contemporary music of the era into a box. So all of these new things that were happening at the time, instead of actually analyze what was going on, critics and public opinion just kind of forced it into the box of expressionism. And while I believe expressionistic art, poetry, and music share many parallels, I also believe that the term acted more of a buzzword for critics during the time who hoped to profit off labeling any contemporary artwork as expressionist. This should challenge the way we group composers in musical eras in the future and as musicians ourselves. It shows that music should be defined by the composer's intent and the listener's response as opposed by the bandwagon of artistic eras. And these are my sources. Thank you, everybody.